The silent room. The castle didn't feel like a home. It felt like a decision someone made long ago and never forgave themselves for. Behind its tall doors, everything was polished and perfect, but the perfection was cold, like it was meant to keep life out rather than welcome it in. Even the torches along the corridor burned without warmth, their flames steady and disciplined, as if they'd been trained. Servants moved like shadows and never met anyone's eyes. In that place, silence wasn't absence, it was law. The vampire king walked those halls alone, not because no one dared to follow him, but because he didn't allow it. His name was King Sorin, and people spoke it the way they spoke storms, with respect, fear, and the private hope that it might pass them by. He wore his crown like a sentence, and his cloak like a curtain drawn between himself and the rest of the world. Even when he stood still, there was something restless in him, like a man who'd spent centuries trying to outrun the sound of his own regret. Tonight, he was going somewhere he hadn't entered in years. The silent room was buried deep in the castle, beyond the council chambers and the halls where portraits watched with cruel, painted eyes. No music ever reached it. No laughter ever survived the doorway. The air grew colder as Sorin approached, and not because of magic. It was the kind of cold that comes from memories no one speaks aloud. 2 guards stood at the entrance, pale and rigid in their armor. They bowed without looking up. Sorin didn't acknowledge them. He placed his palm against the black wood, and the door accepted him like it remembered. Inside, the room was larger than it needed to be, and emptier than it should be. A single chair sat in the center, bolted to the stone floor. Chains hung from the ceiling, unused but never removed, an insult preserved for tradition's sake. There were no windows, only a high vent that breathed stale air in and out as if even the room was tired. And in that chair sat a girl. Not a vampire, not a noble, not someone with the polished emptiness of court. She looked human, young, maybe 17, maybe older, maybe younger. Her hair was dark and tangled from days without proper care, and her wrists were raw where the ropes had rubbed her skin. Yet her posture held a stubborn dignity, like she refused to collapse just because the world expected it. When she lifted her face, Sorin saw bruising along her jaw and dried blood at the edge of her lip. But what startled him most was her eyes. They weren't pleading. They weren't broken. They were furious in a quiet way, the kind of anger that comes from someone who has already cried all their tears and decided it changed nothing. Sorin stopped a few steps away. He didn't speak at first. He let the silence stretch the way he always did. Silence was his weapon. Humans filled it with panic. Vampires filled it with obedience. The girl didn't fill it with anything. She simply stared back. That, more than any blade, made his chest tighten. "You know who I am," Sorin said finally, voice low and controlled. "I know what you are," she replied, and there was no tremble in it. "Kings are just titles people hide behind." The words were reckless, suicidal, even. The guards outside would have dragged her from the chair and punished her for less. But there were no guards in this room. Only Sorin and the girl who had apparently decided fear was not going to be the thing that owned her. He moved closer, slow and measured, like a predator that didn't need to hurry. He could smell her pulse, warm and alive, insisting itself into the cold air. The hunger in him rose like an old addiction waking up. For a moment, it made him almost angry that something as simple as blood could still command him after everything he had done to become king. He leaned in just enough to see the small tremor in her throat. It wasn't fear. It was exhaustion, pain, the body's honest confession. "You were brought here for a reason," he said. "They said you wanted to see me," she answered. "They didn't say why." Sorin's gaze dropped to her hands, bound tight, fingers slightly swollen. He had ordered countless captives chained in that chair over the centuries. Rebels, thieves, hunters, people who thought killing a monster would make them heroes. Sometimes he drank from them. Sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he forgot their faces the moment he left. But this one, He couldn't forget her face even while he was still looking at it. There was something familiar about the way she held herself, as if she had learned, too early, how to endure cruelty without letting it rewrite her soul. That kind of resilience was rare and dangerous. Resilience could turn into courage. Courage could turn into defiance. And defiance had a way of setting entire worlds on fire. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated, not because she was afraid, but because she was deciding whether her name was something she wanted to give him at all. "Myra," she said at last. "And before you ask, no, I'm not going to beg." Soren's mouth tightened. "You assume I want you to beg." Myra's eyes sharpened. "If you didn't, you wouldn't have tied me to a chair." That simple statement struck him harder than it should have, because it was true. The chair wasn't for her. It was for him, for his image, his ritual, his certainty. It was a way to remind himself he was still the kind of king who could do anything and feel nothing. But standing there now, he felt something he hated. He reached out slowly, not to touch her skin, but to lift the thick rope at her wrist and test its tightness. His fingers were cold. Her skin was warm. The contrast made him flinch internally. Warmth always did that. It reminded him of what he'd lost and what he'd taken. Myra didn't pull away. She didn't try to bite him or spit at him or scream. She simply watched him steady, as if she'd decided she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. "Why are you here?" Soren asked, quieter now. "Because I did something kind," she said. The corner of her mouth tightened like it hurt to admit it. "And kindness makes powerful people nervous." Soren stared at her, and the room seemed to narrow around the words. Kindness. In his kingdom, kindness was treated like weakness, something to stamp out before it spread. For a heartbeat, he saw the courtyard outside the castle walls, the poor villages that paid taxes they couldn't afford, the hunger he pretended not to smell when he rode past. Dee told himself cruelty was necessary. Dee told himself mercy was a luxury kings couldn't afford. Myra's wrists were bleeding because she had been kind. His jaw clenched. "Who did you help?" Her eyes flicked away just once, and in that small movement he saw it. She was protecting someone. Not herself, someone else. And that, more than her defiance, was the first crack in the armor Soren had spent centuries building. "Answer me," he said, but the command didn't land the way it usually did. It sounded almost human. Myra breathed in slowly, then met his eyes again. "If I tell you," she said, voice steady but raw, "you'll kill them." Soren's hunger still lived in him. His power still surrounded him. But in that moment, he realized something that made his stomach twist. The girl believed she could stop him. Not with force, she didn't have that. Not with magic, she didn't have that either. She believed she could stop him by refusing to betray someone who mattered to her. It was such a small form of courage, and yet it felt enormous in that room. Soren stared at her for a long time, and the silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't his weapon anymore. It was a question hanging between them. Then, without warning, he reached down and loosened the rope at her wrist. Myra's breath hitched. Her eyes widened, not in relief, but in confusion, suspicion. The kind that comes from people who have been hurt enough to know that mercy can be a trick. Soren freed her other hand, slowly, like he was afraid of his own decision. "You're playing with me," she whispered. "No," Soren said, and it surprised him how true it sounded. He stepped back, as if creating distance could stop the hunger, stop the instinct, stop the long, cruel history that wanted to repeat itself. "I'm testing something." Myra flexed her fingers, wincing at the pain. She didn't run, she couldn't, not with guards outside and a king blocking the only door. Instead, she lifted her chin. "What are you testing?" she asked. Soren opened his mouth, ready to give her the answer he'd always given the world. That he was king, that he could do as he pleased, that kindness was foolish and fear was safer. But the words didn't come. Because right then, just as the air shifted and the torches seemed to dim, Soren heard something he hadn't heard in this room for centuries. A second heartbeat. Not Mira's. Another human was inside the silent room. Hidden. Close. And whoever it was holding their breath, praying the vampire king wouldn't notice. Soren's eyes lifted slowly toward the shadows in the far corner, and Myra's face drained of color as she realized she wasn't the only one who had been brought here. The silence didn't feel like law anymore. It felt like a trap, the thing she wouldn't say. Soren didn't turn his head right away. He kept his eyes on Myra because her face told the truth faster than her mouth ever would. The moment she realized he'd heard that second heartbeat, something inside her seemed to fold in on itself. Her shoulders tensed, not to fight, but to shield. It was the body's instinct to stand between danger and the person you couldn't afford to lose. "You're not alone," Soren said softly. Myra swallowed, and for the first time her courage wavered. Not because she feared for herself, but because she'd been discovered doing the one thing she'd promised she wouldn't do, bringing someone else into the line of fire. "There's no one," she lied, and it was a terrible lie. Too quick, too thin. Soren took one slow step toward the corner of the room where the air felt slightly warmer, the way it does when another living body is pressed against stone. The torches didn't reach that far. The shadows pooled there like ink. For centuries, Soren had been able to hear through walls. Hear fear, hear lies, hear the small betrayals people made when they thought it might buy them an extra breath. This was different. The heartbeat he heard wasn't frantic. It was small, uneven, stubbornly quiet. Someone was trying to disappear. "Myra," Soren said, and the sound of her name in his mouth felt strange. Less like a threat, more like a question. "If you're protecting them, you should tell them to come out." Her jaw tightened. "Don't." That single word landed like a plea she couldn't admit was a plea. Soren paused. In her eyes, he saw something that didn't belong in a prisoner: responsibility. Not the performative kind nobles used to look noble, but the kind that kept people alive when no one else cared. He turned his gaze to the darkness. "Come out," he said, voice controlled, not loud. A king didn't need volume. "If you stay hidden, I will assume you're a threat." The silence stretched. The second heartbeat stuttered. And then a shape moved. A boy stepped into the torchlight as if it physically hurt him to do it. He couldn't have been older than 10 or 11. His clothes were too big, probably stolen, sleeves rolled up again and again to keep from swallowing his hands. Dirt streaked his cheeks like he'd wiped away tears and only made them worse. He held a thin piece of metal in his fist, half a knife, more like a shard, and he pointed it at Soren with an arm that trembled from exhaustion. Soren looked at him without expression, but something cold shifted inside his chest. Not hunger, not annoyance. Memory. The boy's eyes were wide, but not empty. They were alive with a raw, desperate courage that wasn't heroic, only necessary. The kind of courage children find when adults have failed them. Myra moved quickly, placing herself half in front of the boy like her body could change the outcome. "He's just a kid," she said. "He didn't do anything." Soren's gaze stayed on the boy. "Your name?" The boy hesitated. He looked up at Myra as if asking permission, as if his name belonged to her now because she was the only person who'd acted like it mattered. "Elio," he whispered. Soren let the name settle. Elio, a small son. The irony was almost cruel in a room that swallowed light. "And you brought him into my castle," Soren said to Myra, his voice quieter now, sharper at the edges. "Why?" Myra's throat worked. "I didn't bring him here. Your men did." Soren's eyes flicked to her wrists again, still red and swollen. "Then how is he here with you?" Myra didn't answer fast. She seemed to weigh something heavy inside her, deciding what lie would do the least damage. Finally, she said, Because he followed me. Elio's grip tightened on the metal shard. I didn't follow, he blurted out, then immediately looked down like he'd betrayed her. I did, but she told me not to. She tried to make me leave. Mira closed her eyes for a moment, like that small truth had cost her more than the rope ever did. Soren watched them both. Two humans in his private room, one wounded, one starving, both tied to each other by something stronger than survival instinct. People called it foolishness. People like him had built kingdoms on the idea that such bonds were liabilities. He should have been annoyed. He should have been entertained. He should have been hungry. Instead, a different thought rose up, quiet, unwelcome. How long has it been since anyone followed me out of love rather than fear? Mira cleared her throat, forcing herself steady. If you want to punish someone, punish me, she said. He doesn't know anything. He's not part of. Part of what? Soren asked. Her eyes flashed, and for a second her fear transformed into anger. You know exactly what. Your taxes, your raids, the way your nobles take children from the villages for service and no one ever sees them again. The words hit the stone and stayed there. Even the torches seemed to hesitate. Elio's face twisted, and the shard in his hand dipped. He looked suddenly younger, like the anger had slipped and left only grief behind. Soren felt a familiar urge, to crush the accusation before it grew teeth, to remind her that humans were fragile and vampires were not, that he didn't owe her explanations, only obedience. But another part of him, the part he'd buried so deep he sometimes forgot it existed, heard what she was really saying. She wasn't challenging him to be cruel. She was challenging him to admit he had a choice. Soren moved closer, stopping just far enough from Elio that the boy's small weapon looked ridiculous against centuries of strength. He lowered his head slightly, studying the child's face. I don't take children for sport, Soren said. Mira gave a short, bitter laugh. So you take them for tradition, for politics, that's supposed to be better. Soren's eyes narrowed. He could feel the old rage pressing up in him, the rage that kept him safe from guilt. You speak as though you understand what it costs to keep a kingdom from tearing itself apart. I understand what it costs us, Mira shot back, her voice breaking on the last word. The villages don't get to hold the kingdom together. We just bleed for it. Elio flinched at her tone, not because she frightened him, but because she sounded like someone reaching the edge of what they could carry. Soren's chest tightened again, that same uncomfortable pressure. He knew the villages. He knew the hunger. He had smelled it on the wind and turned his horse away. He had convinced himself that distance made him innocent. He looked at Elio's thin wrists, at the hollow beneath his cheekbones, at the way his eyes kept flicking to Mira like she was the only solid thing in the room. You're starving, Soren said to him. Elio lifted his chin, trying to pretend he was. I'm fine. Mira's voice softened despite herself. He hasn't eaten in 2 days. Soren's jaw clenched. 2 days was nothing to a vampire. To a child, it was a slow kind of drowning. He crossed to a small side table near the wall. It was there for interrogations, water, sometimes wine, sometimes a neat arrangement of tools no one ever spoke about. Soren poured water into a cup with steady hands and brought it back. He held it out to Elio, not to Mira. The boy stared at the cup as if it might bite. Mira's eyes widened. What are you doing? Soren didn't answer. He waited. Elio's hands shook. For several seconds, pride and fear wrestled inside him. Then, very slowly, he took the cup with both hands and drank. He tried to be quiet, but his throat worked greedily. When he finished, he didn't say thank you. He looked confused, almost angry, as if kindness from a monster was another kind of cruelty. Mira watched Soren like she couldn't decide whether to trust what she was seeing. You untied me, she said, voice low. You gave him water. Is this a trick? Soren set the empty cup down. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were not. Something restless lived there, an old conflict waking up. "I brought you here to ask you something," he said. Mira's shoulders stiffened. About what? Soren hesitated. In that hesitation lay a truth he rarely allowed himself to touch. He wasn't fully in control tonight. He'd come to the silent room expecting to feel nothing, to perform cruelty like a ritual, to remind himself of the role he played. Instead, a girl with bruised wrists had looked at him like he was still capable of shame. "There is a rebellion forming," Soren said finally. "In the eastern villages, people whisper your name with theirs." Mira's face went still, too still. Elio's eyes snapped to her. Soren watched them carefully. "Are you part of it?" Mira opened her mouth, then closed it. The answer was there, alive behind her teeth, and it was more dangerous than any knife. Before she could speak, Elio stepped forward, surprising them both. He lifted his shard again, higher this time, though his arm trembled worse. "She's not," he said quickly. "It's me, I did it. I wrote the letters, I talked to people, I made them hate you." Mira's head whipped toward him. "Elio, stop." He didn't look at her, his voice cracked. "Don't hurt her." The room went sharp with tension. A child was offering himself to a king who could tear him apart with one hand, and he was doing it without understanding what death truly meant, only understanding love. Soren stared at Elio. Then he looked at Mira, whose eyes shone with a rage that looked almost like grief. In that moment, Soren understood something that made his stomach turn. Mira wasn't just protecting a child. She was protecting a movement. And the boy, this small, starving boy, might be the spark that could burn Soren's kingdom down. Soren took one step forward, and Mira moved instantly, placing herself between them again, her voice trembling with a courage that refused to die. "If you're going to punish someone," she said, "punish me. But if you touch him, I swear I'll spend the rest of my life making sure your name becomes a curse in every human mouth." Soren's eyes darkened, and the air in the silent room seemed to thicken as his ancient power stirred. For a heartbeat, it looked like the old king had returned, the merciless one, the inevitable one. Then Soren spoke, and his words landed like a blade laid gently on a throat. "Tell me," he said, "who taught you to hate me this well?" Mira stared back, and tears finally rose, not from fear, but from the terrible pressure of holding a secret too big for her body. "It was my father," she whispered, "and you already killed him." Soren went perfectly still, because he remembered her father. And he remembered that he hadn't just killed him. He had promised him something, and broken it. The silence that followed was so deep it felt like the castle itself was listening, waiting to see what kind of king would step out of that memory. What the king couldn't undo, final. Soren didn't move, not at first. It wasn't the kind of stillness meant to intimidate. It was the stillness of a man struck somewhere he forgot he could still feel. Mira's words hung in the air like smoke after a fire. "You already killed him." In the torchlight, her eyes looked brighter with tears she refused to let fall, as if even grief had to earn the right to exist in front of him. "What was his name?" Soren asked, though he already knew he shouldn't. Mira's mouth tightened. "You don't get to ask that like you care. You didn't care when he begged." Soren exhaled slowly, and the sound scraped the silence. "Tell me." Mira glanced at Elio, and the boy's small face crumpled with confusion. He didn't understand the history, only the danger. Only that Mira's pain had suddenly become sharper, more personal, like a wound ripped open in front of a stranger. She looked back at Soren with a hatred so pure it almost steadied her. "Gideon Vale," she said. "He was a healer." The name hit Soren like a door slamming shut. Gideon Vale, human, stubborn, fearless in the irritating way only truly good people could be. A man who had treated wounded vampires on the battlefield because he said suffering didn't have a species. A man Soren had captured years ago, not for rebellion, but because the court demanded an example. Gideon had stood in this very room and refused to kneel, even when blood ran down his chin. Soren remembered what Gideon had asked for, not in exchange for his life. He hadn't tried to bargain like that, but as his last request. Don't punish my daughter for my choices. And Soren, in a moment of pride disguised as mercy, had said, she will be spared. Then Soren had walked out and let the council do what it always did, turn promises into ash. The kingdom ran on quiet cruelty, and Soren had allowed it because it was easier than admitting he was afraid of his own throne. Mira watched his face change. She saw recognition land in him, and it enraged her more than denial would have. So you do remember, she said, voice shaking. You remember him as a moment, as a thing you did, but for me he was my whole life. Elio reached for Myra's sleeve, a small anchoring touch. Mira. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed locked on Soren, daring him to speak, to justify, to do anything other than carry the weight of what he'd done. Soren's voice came out lower than he intended. He was brave. Myra's laugh broke, ugly with grief. He was kind, and it killed him. The words weren't poetry. They were accusation and truth pressed together until they bled. In that instant, Soren felt the old structure inside him, the one that kept him functioning as king, begin to crack. He had lived for centuries by dividing the world into necessary evils and unfortunate costs. But Mira didn't speak in politics. She spoke in loss. Soren turned his head slightly, listening past the room. Beyond the door, he could hear footsteps now, faint, measured, more than one pair. Not servants. Not guards doing routine rounds. His council had sensed something. The silent room was never used without consequences, and consequences always attracted men who believed cruelty was a tool, not a choice. Mira heard it too, her face tightened. They're coming. Soren didn't deny it. Yes. For a second, Myra's defiance wavered into something like dread. If they take Elio. They won't, Soren said. Mira stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. You can't stop them. Soren looked at her, and the admission tasted like iron. I can, I just haven't. The footsteps grew closer. Elio's breathing sped up again, the thin shield of courage beginning to fail under the weight of reality. He wasn't a symbol now. He was a child in a castle full of monsters. Soren stepped toward the door, but Mira blocked his path before he could reach it. Her hands were free, yet they curled into fists like she still felt the rope. No, she said. Don't pretend this is redemption. Don't pretend you're saving us because you suddenly found a conscience. Soren met her gaze. You're right. That answer startled her more than any threat. He didn't argue. He didn't posture. He didn't try to earn forgiveness with words. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his cloak and pulled out a small, dark key, old iron, worn by time. He held it out to Mira. What is that? She asked. The East Gate Passage, Soren said. It's not on the maps. It leads beyond the outer wall, through the river tunnel. If you take it now, you can be out before the watch changes. Mira didn't take it. Suspicion hardened her voice again. Why would you help me run? Soren's eyes flicked to Elio, then back to her. Because if you stay, they will make you into an example, and because I made a promise to your father that I didn't keep. Myra's throat trembled. A promise doesn't bring the dead back. No, Soren said, but it can stop me from becoming the thing that killed him. The footsteps were near the door now. Soren could hear the low murmur of voices, counselors, and with them the captain of the inner guard. Men who would smile while they tightened chains, who would call it stability. Myra's eyes searched his face, trying to find the trick, the hidden cruelty. She found something else instead, fear, Not fear of her, but fear of himself, of what he would become if he kept choosing the easy path. "I don't trust you," Mira said, voice raw. Soren nodded once. "You shouldn't." He pressed the key into her palm anyway, closing her fingers around it with cold, careful hands. The touch lasted a second too long, like he needed the physical confirmation that he was doing something real, not imagining it. Then the door boomed with a knock. "Your Majesty," a voice called from outside, smooth, respectful, hungry. "We heard there are guests." Mira flinched. Elio grabbed her sleeve hard. Soren lifted his chin, the old king's posture sliding back into place like armor. But it wasn't the same armor now. This wasn't pride. It was decision. He turned to Mira and spoke fast, low. "When I open this door, they will look at me. You take Elio and go to the left wall. There's a panel behind the third torch sconce. Push it in, then down. Don't hesitate." Mira stared at him, almost disbelieving. "And you?" Soren's mouth tightened. "I will give you time." "By doing what?" she demanded. Soren's gaze held hers. "By finally ruling." The knock came again, harder. "Your Majesty, open the door." Soren moved to the door, placed his hand on the black wood, and paused. In that pause, he looked over his shoulder one last time. "Mira," he said quietly. She stood frozen, Elio behind her, key clenched in her fist. "What?" Soren swallowed something old and bitter. "Your father was right. Kindness is not weakness. It is the only thing strong enough to survive power." Myra's eyes glistened, but she refused to let tears fall. "Then prove it." Soren opened the door. 3 counselors stood outside with the captain of the guard and 6 armored vampires behind him. Their faces carried polite interest, the way men look at a problem they already intend to solve. They peered past Soren into the room. "My king," the eldest counselor said, voice silky. "We can take custody of the prisoners, the child as well. Unregistered humans don't belong inside the walls." Soren stepped out, closing the door behind him with a finality that made them blink. He smiled slightly, a thin expression with no warmth. "No," Soren said, "you can't." The counselor's eyes narrowed. "Your Majesty, the law." "I am the law," Soren said, and the hallway seemed to chill in response. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried an ancient authority that made even the guards stiffen. "And I'm changing it." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then the captain forced a careful laugh. "With respect, sire, the court will not accept weakness." Soren's eyes hardened. "Mercy is not weakness." The eldest counselor's politeness vanished, replaced by something sharper. "Is this because of the girl? A human means nothing. We maintain order by removing disruptions." Soren heard Mira behind the door now, faint movement, a soft scrape, the sound of a panel shifting. His pulse didn't quicken, but something in him steadied, like he had finally stopped running from himself. "You maintain order," Soren said. "By feeding on fear, you have used my name as permission." The counselor took a slow step forward. "Your Majesty, think carefully. The nobles will rebel against you if you protect humans. They will call you unfit." Soren's gaze didn't flicker. "Then let them." The corridor went quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before violence. One of the younger counselors looked uncertain, glancing between Soren and the guards as if searching for the safest side. The eldest counselor's voice dropped. "Sire, we can replace you." Soren smiled again, but this time there was pain in it. "I know." And he moved. Soren didn't strike like a beast. He moved like a storm choosing where to fall. In a blur of cloak and shadow, he disarmed the captain first, twisting the man's wrist until the sword clattered to stone. He caught it before it hit the floor, not even looking, and held the blade at the captain's throat without breaking eye contact with the counselors. "This is the moment," Soren said quietly. "You learn the difference between my patience and your power." One guard lunged. Soren struck him aside with a backhand that snapped armor straps and sent him skidding across the corridor. Another tried to flank him. Soren slammed him into the wall hard enough to crack stone. Not killing blows, controlled. Deliberate. Soren wasn't hunting. He was making a point. The youngest counselor backed away, shaking. "This is madness." "No," Soren said, voice like ice. "This is restraint." Behind him, the door to the silent room creaked almost imperceptibly, then fell silent again. Mira and Leo were moving. The eldest counselor's face twisted with fury. "You'd turn against your own kind for a human girl." Soren's eyes flashed. "I'm turning against cruelty." The counselor spat the last of his civility. "You'll destroy everything we built." Soren leaned in close enough for the counselor to smell the centuries on him. "You built a cage and called it a kingdom." Then Soren released the captain with a shove that sent him stumbling. He lifted his voice, not a shout, but a command that rolled down the corridor like thunder. "Guards," he said, "stand down." The 6 armored vampires hesitated. Their training told them to obey the captain. Their blood told them to obey the king. For a moment, the entire castle seemed balanced on that hesitation. One guard lowered his weapon first. Then another. The captain stared at them, stunned. The eldest counselor's eyes widened with a sudden understanding that tasted like fear. Soren wasn't just protecting 2 humans. He was taking his throne back from the people who had been using it. Soren turned, and through the narrow window slit at the end of the corridor, he saw movement far below, courtyard watchmen shifting, sensing tension. If this ignited, it would become civil war. Vampires against vampires, the court against the crown. Soren had avoided that outcome for centuries by letting the court do what it wanted. He thought of Gideon Vale's face, of the promise, of Mira's wrists, of Leo offering himself like a sacrifice because love had taught him that's what you do. Soren looked back at the counselors. "Leave," he said, "and tell the nobles, any house that takes humans from the villages will answer to me. Any officer who raids without my seal will be executed." The eldest counselor laughed, but it sounded brittle. "You can't enforce that alone." Soren's gaze held steady. "I'm not alone anymore." The words surprised even him, because they were true in a way he hadn't expected. Not that Mira belonged to him. She didn't. But her presence had forced him to face the part of himself that still wanted to be more than a monster with a crown. The counselors retreated, their pride retreating with them, and the corridor emptied in a rush of controlled anger. Soren stayed standing until their footsteps faded. Only then did he return to the silent room. He opened the door and stepped inside. The chair was empty. The ropes lay coiled on the floor like shed skin. The torch sconce on the left wall sat slightly crooked, and the hidden panel behind it was ajar just enough to show darkness beyond. A faint draft carried the smell of river water and cold stone. Mira and Leo were gone. Soren stared at the open passage for a long time, his chest tight with something that wasn't hunger. He listened for their heartbeats, but distance swallowed sound. He told himself that was good, that it meant they had a chance. Then he noticed something on the chair. A strip of cloth, torn from Mira's sleeve, neatly folded, as if she'd left it on purpose. On it, in rough charcoal scraped from the torch soot, were a few words written in quick, urgent handwriting. "If this is real, don't just save us. Save the villages." Soren closed his eyes. The demand wasn't mercy. It wasn't gratitude. It was a challenge, clear, brave, almost cruel in its honesty. Mira hadn't asked him to feel sorry. She de-asked him to change. When Soren opened his eyes again, he looked older somehow, not in face but in spirit, like someone who had finally accepted the weight of a life he could no longer pretend was unchangeable. He walked to the chains hanging from the ceiling and gripped them. With one violent pull, he tore them free. Iron shrieked against stone. The sound echoed through the castle like a confession. Servants would hear it, guards would hear it, the court would hear it. Let them. Soren left the silent room and didn't close the door behind him. He crossed the corridor and climbed the stairs to the highest balcony where the kingdom spread below like a dark sea. He could see the distant lights of the human villages beyond the wall, small, trembling points in the night, surviving anyway. He thought of Elio's shaking hands, holding a useless piece of metal. He thought of Mira's voice saying kindness makes powerful people nervous. Soren placed a hand on the stone railing, and for the first time in centuries, he allowed himself to speak a truth without hiding it behind power. "I will be the kind of king they fear," he murmured into the cold night, "or the kind of king they deserve." Behind him, somewhere deep inside the castle, an alarm bell began to ring, sharp, urgent, the sound of a system realizing it had been challenged. The court was moving. The nobles would gather. They would plot. They would strike back. Soren didn't flinch. Far beyond the walls, hidden in the river tunnel, a girl and a boy ran toward uncertain freedom with a key that shouldn't have existed, chased by the risk that a monster's mercy might not survive the morning. And as the first pale hint of dawn began to bruise the horizon, Soren turned from the light he could not endure and walked back into the castle to face the war he had finally chosen, knowing he might die for it, knowing he might deserve to. But also knowing, with a strange and steady certainty, that Mira's kindness had already changed his fate forever.